All right, the recording's on, so go ahead. Thank you.
Thanks. Hi, everyone, and welcome on this Monday evening. So as Anna told you already, my name is Daniel. Quickly about me, I'm currently actually building a startup of my own. Before that, I was a chief product officer in Printify and a number of other companies. In Printify, I grown the company from 20 people to about 700 people right now, and build up the product team. Initially, it was 5 people. I think when I was leaving about 2 months ago, it was about 200 people. I also had my own company. Prior to that, it's not listed here, in also e-commerce space, but mostly my experience is in growth or product development, predominantly on marketplaces and platforms, and predominantly in digital space, although I was working in mix of digital and physical as well. So a lot of the advices and slides that you will be seeing, a lot of it will be going from the building a digital product, but it doesn't mean that those frameworks do not apply to physical products as well. So quick thing on an organizational part. The first part will be roughly 50 minutes. Once that is done, we'll have a longer question session and a short break. Then we'll have a second part, which will be till 8 o'clock, and then final question and answer, longer question and answer session as well. As Anna already mentioned, the question you might have in between, you can still ask them in chat or use a raise hand function. I will try to answer them going along. And if anything, write them down, and then we'll discuss them during the question breaks. So let's do into it. So my section today is called Achieving Product Market Fit and Traction, which to me is essentially meaning that you will be able to have a market validation, because if you have a product market fit and if you have attraction, it means that you have validated your product and you have validated the market. So just sorry, but before we start, I need to go first through product lifecycle, touching on multiple points, because you cannot really talk about product market fit and market traction without walking through different cycles of product development. And obviously, the first cycle on a strategic level is achieving initial product market fit. It means that you achieve the product market fit, you have established the connection between your market and your product. Usually the second part is feature development, meaning that you have established the initial one, but you need to entrench it. And so it means that you need to strengthen the product market fit. And to do that, you usually try to develop additional features or enhance existing ones to strengthen your product market fit and make it more defensible. After that, there is usually a stage called growth and scaling, meaning that you try to improve one of the 3 main components of growth, being it either acquisition, retention, or monetization. And that will be covered as part of this series of sessions, but it will be covered in a last session of the cycle. And then the last one is product market fit expansion, meaning that you try to expand your product market fit to adjacent markets or adjacent verticals and add new products so that your overall potential market grows. But today we will be predominantly talking about initial product market fit, because all of the other stages of product development are not possible without achieving the initial one. So what is product market fit? So product market so before we talk about what product market fit is essentially it is a step towards achieving a go-to-market strategy. So determining product market fit is a first vital step to a successful go-to-market strategy. And to do that, there are multiple stages how you can do it. Product market fit sometimes seem like a very magical thing, and everybody's talking about, and there are a lot of frameworks, and obviously a lot of books are written about it. Because we have a certain limited amount of time, I will be covering the framework that I usually use for achieving a product market fit, which is called the product market fit pyramid. And it consists out of multiple stages. So the first one is understanding who is your target customer. It means that you understand your customer, you understand their behaviors, you understand the problems that they're facing, and you also understand their needs and their psychographics persona, let's put it like this. The second stage is usually understanding the needs. And that means covering two sides of it, because there are different types of need depending on the market. Sometimes there are unmet needs, sometimes there are unrealized needs, but essentially it means that you understand your customer, understand what kind of needs they have. That means that you understand, in general, understand the market, because without having a target customer in your mind when you're building a product, and without having understanding of the problem, you cannot really understand the market. And on the other side, you have a value proposition. So it means that once you start doing a certain level of solution, you need to understand how your solution will be positioned on the market, what will be your value proposition that you can deliver to your customer and that can win that market, and at what, let's say, price point you will be selling it, and so on. Then you will have, once you have your core value proposition, then you need to establish a feature set that will be part of your product. As well know, having just a random idea is definitely a first step, but before you turn this idea of a solution or idea how you solve the problem, you need to clarify it. You need to understand how the final solution will look like, what kind of features that solution will possess, and how how can we build a solution that without too many investment, and that feature set will show us that the market needs that solution. And the final stage is obviously UX, so user experience. So how this number of features will be put together and then combined in the final product, so that we can package it and sell it as a one thing. So that's the two things of product, two kind of main components of a product market fit pyramid. And achieving connection between them essentially means that you achieve the product market fit. The important thing here is that you need to go here through this pyramid from bottom up. So you need to start with your target customer. So you need to identify who they are, you need to find them. You need to understand their needs, and you need to enumerate them. Then once you have those things, then you need to go and define your core value proposition. Then when you have that, you identify what are the key features your product will possess. And then finally, once you have identified that, you develop and test your user experience. And we'll go through each of those in more detail going forward. So the first, let's talk about the market. This quote from Steve Jobs that I really like, and I think everybody thinks that Steve Jobs was this crazy marketing genius, and well, he was both marketing and product genius. I think that he kind of invented a lot of those things, but to be honest, I think the true genius of Steve Jobs is that he said more times he said no than he actually said yes. And it was one of his marketing director, actually, Ken Block, who was working with him when Steve Jobs rejoined Apple. I met him, and he told me that the best thing that Steve Jobs tried to do is coin the phrase "less is more." So he tried to simplify things as much as possible. So what it means is Steve Jobs tried to say a lot of time tried to say no to the things that he thought are not important, and try to understand what is the core thing we're trying to solve, understand the problem, the core problem that they're trying to solve. And that's actually is one of the things you need to be thinking all the time once you're going through the market and to the product. So going forward, sorry, I have a bit, okay. So the first step to do that is defining your one persona. To understand what it means is that you need to be very focused and very sequential about your market strategy. And you need to understand for whom you're building or for whom you are targeting with your potential solution. What it means that you probably will be more successful. You focus more resources on meeting fewer needs. It also means that you need to be laser focused on a very simple or very targeted persona that you understand very well. And what it also means, if you have this very defined persona and it's very fleshed out, your velocity toward product market fit generally accelerates because you understand when to say no all the time. Essentially, you understand when you have to say yes to a certain idea, a certain problem, and when to say no to it. And with a rare exception, most of the great companies nowadays, they started with one user persona, one user type, and they tried to build the first product that was targeted to meeting the needs of one user type. And because you're always limited in resources, especially when you're starting out, you definitely want to eliminate as much noise as possible and try to be laser focused on that one user persona. So what does it mean to have one user persona? I think a lot of people think that it means that defining things like demographics and so on, like, oh, that's like woman, 35, living in, I don't know, Berlin, and that and that income and blah, 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 all that stuff. That's definitely helpful and that definitely needs to be done. But great user persona go much, much beyond that. Couple of things that I want to note here is thinking about not only demographic traits, but also psychographic traits. Things like using Ocean or DISC, for those who are not familiar, those are personality trait frameworks that allow you to understand not only person behavioral, person demographic perspective, but also behavioral perspective. So Ocean, for instance, stands for openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And all of those traits, people being more open or closed, open-minded or closed-minded, more agreeable, disagreeable, more extrovert or introvert, that all defines how you want to build your product and also how you overall want to define your product go-to-market strategy. Because, for instance, a couple of startups that I have consulted had different types of personas that definitely impacted how they develop their go-to-market strategy. For instance, one of the startups, they're working with engineers, especially like industrial engineers who are generally very introverted. They prefer not to speak to people, versus where another solution works and builds a solution that is intended for salespeople who are much more extroverted and want to connect with people. And depending on that, you want to design your solution and also design your actual sales strategy differently. So apart from that, it helps a lot if you're at the early stages starting to flesh out things like where they hang out online and offline and what other product they're already using. Even those products are not directly competitive with you, but you see the patterns that they're being used by those people, especially if those products are generally a larger part of your potential ecosystem. So, for instance, for salespeople, those guys are providing kind of this email automation software for them, like auto reply software. We also understood that they're using a lot of sales CRMs and so on and so on. And those products were not competitive, but it's really good to understand those things early on, but also understanding things like, okay, they hang out professionally on conferences, on they listen to different podcasters who are covering different sales tactics and so on, because this helps you to understand later on how to also design your go-to-market strategy. And the last thing is kind of understanding what are behaviors that those potential users or that one user persona that they are trying to flesh out, what kind of behaviors that persona has that prove that the existing there is a problem that you potentially want to solve, or there is potentially even need for a solution. Initially, you want to obviously nail the problem, but if you can also at this stage already try to understand if there is a need for a solution, that's even better. So now we covered the first part of the pyramid, which is defining your user persona. The next step, as you understand, is understanding user problem, or identifying user problems and needs. And here you can do, there are a lot of tactics how you can do that. Obviously, there are tens or even sometimes probably hundreds of different tactics, but I will try to outline the most common ones. So the first one is quantitative data analysis. Obviously, if you're starting out, you probably don't have your own data or internal data, but you definitely can use market data. You can either try to find market research that is done by other companies or by Big Four companies, or any other market research companies that can prove that there is a problem that exists in the market, and then it can be proven via quantitative data. Obviously, the second one is qualitative surveys and user studies. It means that you can run different types of surveys with different types of questionnaires. You can conduct user studies. You can also look at the surveys and studies that have been done by either other company or other entities, and nowadays a lot of things are already available on the internet. If you're, let's say, you have a bit more cash lying around and you want to do some validation, it's also possible to order custom studies through dedicated research companies. The pricing varies a lot depending on the extensiveness of the study, but that's also always a possibility. So doing a qualitative research is another one. Classical market research, where you go in to understand what the market looks like, what the competitive density looks like, what the size of the market. That's also definitely needs to be done, because without that, you cannot also understand what is the market attractiveness overall, but we'll cover that a bit later. Informal discussion with friends, colleagues, network, someone in your network, and so on, definitely help. And this is actually how a lot of feature ideas came out in Printify, through informal discussion. Not only but through that, but those informal discussions definitely help. So especially if you're starting out, my recommendation is always be talking about your problem, what you're trying to build, and pitch it to everyone. You never know who can provide you some additional information. For instance, I just recently, while building my company, I had a meeting with my friend from New York this Friday, and was pitching this idea, and he said, "Oh man, I think I can help you with connecting you with this head of sales with another company who is doing something similar, but with another vertical, which they're doing for like recreational vehicles." And yeah, and then talked to that guy earlier today, and I found a lot of things that I wouldn't found otherwise. So kind of having informal discussion about your things and pitching it to everyone sometimes helped you to land some lead or some person who can provide you with additional information. And obviously heuristics, as in intuition-based or prior experience-based. If you have some domain knowledge, if you want to build a company in the same domain that you were working before, then you have much higher success to be right, because you have worked in that industry, you know this industry inside out, and that means that you have additional validation that the problem is there. Now, there are two ways, there are two main parts to understanding the problem and then identifying underserved needs. The first one is unmet needs. So it means that the customer needs are not adequately met by the current solution. Those are much easier to do, and that means the customer know about them. It just now there are no solution on the market that have already solved the problem already. And then there are a second type of needs, which are called unrealized needs, and that means that instead of trying to solve what customers know they need to be solving, you need to understand those needs that users don't even know that they have. That means that it's much harder to identify those, but the potential uplift, let's call it uplift, by solving those unrealized needs is much, much higher. And let's look at each of those in a bit more detail. So if we're talking about unmet needs, that means that you deliver what users need. You can go at it through iterative improvements, means that you can gradually iterate on the solution and eventually achieve the product market fit. It is much more risk averse if you're following that that path. It's also much more risk averse, not only from building a product that you can build a product that achieves product market fit faster. It's also much less risky once you start raising money, because raising money for unrealized need product is a bit harder. You also have more data points to conduct your user data analysis, because you see the behaviors that users have and you try to build upon them. Opportunity is much easier to spot, but on the flip side, you kind of need to expect that you will have slower and steady growth instead of achieving this super hyper growth speed as achieved by the famous 10x growth companies. And in general, those needs are user inspired. So users are addressing, they are expressing those needs, and they are willing to express those needs. And that means that after you have you've done your first launch, it's much easier to validate or disprove them, because users understand what they need. On the flip side, on the counter side, is meeting unrealized needs. It means that it solves a latent problem. What it means is that users do not technically understand that they have a problem. They might be fine doing things that they're doing right now. And to give you an example, so we don't keep talking in too abstract terms. So Uber, for instance, solved an unrealized needs. There was a solution theoretically that solved a need for transportation from point A to point B, and there was already a taxi, but people didn't realize that they have this amazing device in their pocket, where instead of trying to call the cab on the street and then waiting until you get one, you can just press 2 buttons on your phone, and then your transportation vehicle arrives within a couple of minutes and takes you wherever you need to go. So it is a latent problem. Users didn't realize that they need such a solution, but once that solution is provided, then it creates a hyper growth scenario where it is so much better than anything else. It's usually 10x time better. It means that you can just grow super fast. So that's also opened those called greenfield bets. Means that you have a full greenfield that without no competition, and you're pretty much the only one on the market. You can do whatever you want until there is another competition arises, but they are much later to the game. This also means that you are playing high risk, high reward. So if it plays out, then you are up for a lot of grab. If not, well, it is what it is. It also disregards status quo. So it means that everything that was before that technologically wise probably will be disrupted quite significantly. It requires quite fresh thinking and innovative approach. There are a couple of books nowadays that acknowledge this, like Radical Product Thinking and so on. And usually solving unrealized needs creates completely new market that didn't even exist before. So Airbnb created a completely new market for for peer-to-peer hostings, let's put it like this. And a lot of people now are making their living by renting out either their own apartments or their own real estate, or buying let's say a series of properties and then renting them out and creating a living out of it. That didn't exist before, at least didn't exist at the scale that it exists right now. And obviously Airbnb is a massive company that captured a lot of that market because they were first at the game. But as I said, it's also, they had really tough time raising round first on. And in a lot of cases, those meeting unrealized user needs means that those are technology inspired as opposed to user inspired, meaning that sometimes there are problems and people do not realize that they have problem until you overlay it with a new either with a new technology or with an innovative thinking how to solve those needs, and solve it by applying this innovative thinking toward the problem. So we just covered the user persona. We covered the problems that there are, how to identify the problem in the user needs. But there's also one more thing, and let me pause. Are there a lot of questions? Okay, I will answer this question a bit afterwards. Understanding mass market attractiveness. Apart from having a predefined user persona and understanding the user needs, you also need to understand what the overall market attractiveness looks like. And generally, it means to understanding three things. One is, what is your total market size? So understanding how large is the market if we solve a particular user problem. The second one is understanding market growth potential. Is the market we're trying to enter growing, shrinking, or being stagnant? And the third one is, what is the competitive density in that market? And that means that is the market consolidated, fragmented, or completely open? And all of those things will in a way dictate how you want to approach your product market fit strategy. In general, the good rule of thumb is to look for big market with a lot of opportunities, growing market with potential to add a lot of value over time, and the markets with as few competitors as possible, or in some cases, very fragmented market where some kind of platform play would allow you to aggregate that market and create a dominating position. Obviously, everything is not possible at the same time, and there are fewer and fewer markets like that. So you always need to have a trade-offs to understand how to enter those markets, because usually there are almost no market where there is no competition at all. So that means that you need to look at your product, understanding how can you build a product that addresses those competitive landscape in a way, in an innovative way, in a way that you can win bigger market share with a better product. And this leads us to the second part of the product market fit pyramid, which is product. And the first thing we need to talk, obviously, is about value proposition. So what is your product's value proposition? So to define value proposition, you need to look at the following thing. So what, essentially, what is a product or a service you are building that solves a certain certain user needs or certain user problem? The second is who, so the users that has a significant need for the product. We already discussed that. And the third one is obviously how. So the business model employed to deliver product, the marketing strategy to use to drive growth. And we'll go through all of those things in much more detail, but that's just the core principle of the value proposition. So ask yourself those three questions. So how will your product add customer needs better than any alternative? So are you building a faster product, a better user experience? Is it cheaper? Is it delivers more value within the same package? And much more, and I will cover a bit more about this later on. The second one is, out of all potential customer needs you probably could address, which one matters the most? Because instead of trying to focus on the broad range of customer needs, it's much easier to narrow down towards one persona and one key need that is the most painful, and focus on that and build solution around that. And the third one is which will have the biggest impact and take the least amount of time and effort to produce. So how can we build the MVP, or minimal viable product, to achieve that and solve the first and the second question at the same time? So looking at this, there are three ways how you can differentiate a product in the market, and those being so sort of three columns or three tenets to differentiated market position. The first one is value. So it means that delivering more value than any competitive solution. And we'll talk a lot about value later on today, but essentially it means that you either provide more value for the same buck, or you provide the value cheaper, the same value for the cheaper price. That's both ways are possible. Then there is a service differentiator, meaning that your CX, or customer experience, is your first principle, and it means that you establish user trust, and that's also a very good defensibility tactic, meaning that you focus on providing service better than any of your competitors. And this is especially true if in the first case you can either build more value and deliver it at the same price, or provide the same value for a lower price. Meaning, for instance, the competitors would be, think of it as, for those who don't know, for those who know, think of Adobe Photoshop and Canva. The Canva kind of provides partially the same value that Photoshop does, but at a much cheaper price, and they provide a subset of that value, pretty much the same thing Photoshop does, but Photoshop is targeted toward different users, which are more professional users, and because they always are targeting the professional user, forgot about the common, let's call it a common man, and that's kind of where Canva swooped in and came at a much cheaper price and conquered a lot of the market from Photoshop some time ago. So in the case of better CX, think of, I think the closest we can have right now on the market that everybody knows is Volt versus Bolt. Volt is generally have a much better customer experience, both on a service side and on a product side, I would believe, but that's kind of arguable. And that's their main currently kind of market differentiator. And the third one is convenience. So the personalization, subscription, easy return, fast shipping, and so on and so on. There are a lot of things around convenience that you can think of how to differentiate your product, and then we can discuss it a bit later on as well. So then, once you have your idea, you have your product, you need to ideate your potential solution hypothesis. So basically, understand how can you go from a very high level principle to a more refined approach. So here we need to specify how can we deliver the value. So first we need to understand what we need to deliver, and then we also need to specify how to deliver that value as quickly as possible, the how. So remember the first slide. This is also where you move from what is called the problem space, where you try to understand what the problems the users are having, the needs that they're having, and move it to closer to the solution space. So you start iterating on a much more tangible things, essentially how your product will function in the long run. And this is where you probably will have a lot of hypotheses. So instead of thinking about only the problem, and then by that point you already need to have some kind of validation that this problem exists, and it's a painful enough problem to solve. You have multiple hypotheses of how this problem can be solved, because essentially every problem can solve in a lot of different ways. And before jumping into one particular solution, I strongly suggest everyone to think of as many potential hypotheses or solutions, how this problem can be solved, and kind of list them. And at this point, some kind of ideation document should be created for each solution to be evaluated, because at this point, you need to start drafting, let's call it your draft document of how solution would function or would work before doing any significant work or any significant investment with your developers, designers, or whoever is final participant that would be working on a solution. And one really good advice that I received from a lot of my mentors is that you should practice non-attachment to those ideas. So think of them as theories that can only prove through research and experimentation. Don't assume anything, because you don't want to get attached to any particular solution and then get stuck with a solution that nobody actually needs. What you want to build a successful business, so you should be attached to the problem instead of the solution, and only use a scientific approach to prove that that solution would work. And this is where it comes down to the scientific method, how the solution ideation and validation basic assumption should work. So you always start with your solution idea. Obviously, you start with your problem, you start with your user, you start with your market, but then you ideate through multiple solutions, and each solution needs to be tested in some way. Mostly those solutions are tested by interacting with actual users. Depending on what's your access to numbers of users is, you can use different methods to test it. In general, I suggest just creating some kind of very high level ideation document and just discuss with users how, if this thing would be built, would they be happy, would they need such a solution, and so on. And then if you have a co-founder or co-founders or a team, you need to discuss if the solutions and how, once you test it against the users, have you validated that this solution would work, or people do not agree that this solution would work. And then if you do not agree, or this invalidated your idea, then you can either iterate on it. So it means that it's not enough to completely write it off and look for a completely new idea. Sometimes it makes sense to iterate on the idea, build upon it, and then go back to solution ideation phase, rework it, and then try again. If this is a completely failure, then obviously you need to reject it and start pretty much from scratch. But if you have validated the idea, then you need to proceed to what's called a solution brief, where this is and where we go to the next step, one slide in between. So then if you validate it, you go into solution brief. Couple of things to think about while doing this is grow attached to user problems rather than potential solution. As I already mentioned before, you want to be solving the user problem or user need instead of just having a great idea and get attached to it. Obviously, sometimes there are cases where the solution needs some traction and people do not understand that they need a problem. That's where this unrealized needs things come into place. But even then, you need to understand that although those unrealized needs, it does still mean that there is a problem underneath. It doesn't mean that you can just have a solution that nobody needs and then try to force people to buy it. That unfortunately will not work. And but also by using the scientific method that was described before, it allows to assess potential solution with scientific objectivity. It means that you eliminate any personal biases or any team personal biases that might arise by just having prior experience or, well, any kind of biases that a team might have. And there, as you know, there are a lot of different biases. And also doing the scientific approach is stimulates innovative thinking. It means that you try to go through multiple solutions or multiple ideas before you settle on one thing. Right, so scientific method, this is a very big chart, so I will not go through it, but a couple of things you have for scientific method, you always have your basic assumption, a modern understanding of best practices or winning approaches is presupposed. So you do some ideation exercises. Then you have your solution hypothesis. So a proposed solution to a user need or problem based on information inputs. Then you have information input, includes existing data or observable user behavior and user feedback. Intuition or result of related studies of competitive products. Then you have, data inputs. So some kind of quantified measurements, observations subjected to systemized statistical scrutiny. So it means when you already expose your solution to the user, you can gather some kind of data input. And as I said, data can be both quantitative and qualitative. Then you have either disproved hypothesis, so it means that your idea about the solution was not proven, and you have iteration and improvement. I'm sorry, I need to have a drink. Sorry about that. Yeah, so that's the scientific method. The next thing that you need to think is defining your feature set. And as you said, you initially have you have your solution hypothesis, but once you have validated your solution hypothesis, once you have enough validation against the market that this solution potentially would work, you need to transfer it from just abstract solution into the number of features that the final product will possess. And that means now that the value you intend to deliver has been defined, you need to specify how to deliver that value as quickly as possible. And this also means that instead of trying, this is where actually saying no is very important, because what you need to do is establish the confidence and priority of number of features that your initial product will have. And this is where a lot of, I see a lot of failures for multiple teams, because they want to squeeze in everything possible under their minimal viable product, but you have to remember at this point, you still have nothing. You have not invested a single hour or at least a very, very minimal hour of engineering work or design work. At this point, you pretty much done as much, as little as possible actual production work. And this is also where you need to understand your development capacity. So essentially, number of design engineering hours per week or in total that you can have or you possess, depending on your on the availability of your co-founders or the amount of money you're willing to spend on it, and so on and so on. So this is where you actually need to define what your minimal viable product will look like and what kind of features it will possess. And before we go into even further, you need to understand what some of the kind of core principle of how products are defined. And again, I'm talking mostly from digital product perspective here, but essentially, let's take Google Maps, because I think everybody used it at least once and have understanding of what kind of feature Google Maps possess. So all of those features are essentially part of the product, but as a discrete features, they're just discrete features. They are not constitute the product. So the feature bundle is what constitutes a product. So the Google Maps has a number of features like Street View, terrain, 3D maps, timeline, local search, and so on and so on. So only once you put those features together that solve a certain problem or a multitude of problems, you have a final product. And what you can do with those features, essentially three things. And this applies both for once you already start doing the feature work, or you're only doing initial prioritization or initial trying to understand what is a feature bundle would look like for our initial product. And essentially what you can do is obviously add new features. So in this case, adding a transit feature. You can rethink or enhance existing features. So if you have some kind of validation that this feature does not work as intended, or we need to rethink it, we usually rethinking, and in most cases it also means that they're enhanced. And you can also remove features or kill features. If the existing product, you kill them. If it's a product that is still being ideated upon, and you need to get to MVP, then you remove those features from your essentially MVP feature bundle. And when you think about feature prioritization, what you want to do is prioritize the following features. So you obviously want to find opportunities to solve multiple problems with single feature, meaning that if you found a way, or you found multiple problems around the same area for a user, you want to have a single feature that solves multitude of those at the same time. You also want to push for broadly applicable features instead of features for specific use case or segment, because it means that they will provide value for a broader user segment or a broader sets of use cases. You also want to look for creating recurring value over one-time value. What it means that instead of building let's say an example, a referral program, which creates a one-time value for each referee and each referral. Well, maybe not a one-time, maybe a couple of times, but it's not a continuously usable feature. Or building something like timeline in your product, or some kind of flow chart in your product, which is constantly being used by one of your users. You always need to prioritize for something that can be reused, or it consistently creates recurring value instead of one-time value, at least at the early on. And the final thing, you want to build features that create value over capturing value. So it means that they at this point, when you're doing an MVP, you're not that concerned about capturing values in how would you monetize it. You're more concerned, how can we create as much value as possible so that users would love the product and will be using it. And the monetization or value capture, whereas you provide value and you capture value usually via some kind of monetary transaction, that will definitely come later once you have an MVP out. So once you have thought through all of that, okay, this is actually already a repeating slide, I'm sorry. Yeah, and the last thing before we jump to the final is feature prioritization. There are a lot of different prioritization techniques out there. I personally, in the last 2-3 years, was mostly using RICE scoring. It is essentially a way to determine priority among various features, understanding which features get into the minimal viable product bundle and which don't, or at least if they don't get in the first iteration, like when in the pipeline we put them, so we can eventually add them as we iterate on the product. So RICE is essentially, it's an effort value prioritization techniques, but it also takes into account the confidence, meaning that how confident you are about the outcome of a particular feature. And it's pretty simple. This is a formula. Usually you have reach, which is how many potential users how many potential users within your product would be impacted by your feature. And it obviously depends on a lot of factors, depending how you design your user flow, depending where in the journey the feature would lie. But that's one thing that you need to look. Then there is impact. It's just kind of more of a subjective 1 to 5x impact. So meaning like how impactful this feature would be and how much value it would provide if we would develop this. This mostly comes from your qualitative research and talking to users. Then the confidence, it means that how confident you are in your estimates on reach, impact, and also effort, which is the last one we'll cover in a bit later. And it means that you're super confident that it will have the impact, have the reach, or you're not so sure as well. And then the final is effort. Usually it's, again, it's usually measured from 1 to 5, and you measure it in weeks or days, depending on what scale you're operating on, from your engineering, design, data science, whoever else is involved in your product development, but stakeholders as well, but you somehow need to measure effort. And the idea here is that as you talk to users more, as you gather more data, your confidence should go up. And if you see that certain features are not cutting it, there are 2 ways to do it. Either think of how can we make them, how develop them easier, or how can we drive the confidence that this will actually deliver the impact or the reach as we intended. So those are mainly the two things that you want to drive. The reach and impact, it should be more or less objective based on your research. And obviously what falls below the line of our capacity planning will become eventually fast follows to your minimal viable product. And we finally get to the solution brief, which is essentially a prerequisite to propose solution acceptance, prioritization, and feature roadmap. Before you even start doing prioritization, this is where you want to get. It articulates a problem and proposed solution in a way that anyone can understand, even non-technical and non-technical stakeholders and teams. Meaning that if you have a team of non-engineers as well, you want to have a common document where what you want to build is outlined, so everybody gets on the same page. I multiple times have seen where people agree on things, but while it's not on the paper, while the document is kind of read by everyone and everybody agrees this is what we're building, people sometimes has a lot of assumptions in their head, and sometimes when people start thinking about, okay, what we're actually building, unless it's on a paper or in some kind of written form, it can create some friction between early teams. It also determines viability by testing assumption prior to writing any production code or, well, creating any clickable prototype, because nowadays a lot of prototyping can be done without any code at all. And it essentially serves as a single source of truth for product and engineers and everybody else. And this is where you can reference all the assets and artifacts related to the project. So you can reference also all your research essentially. And this is, once you have the solution brief, it essentially serves an exit criteria for entering your design phase, both technical and visual, because nowadays there is also needs to be a technical design, as in your architecture, your, I don't know, like infrastructure solution, and so on and so on. So before you go into doing any actual work, you need to follow all of the things above. And then you do the prototype. You cannot really do, like, when that is done, when you go through all the processes before that, you need to do the prototype. You need to understand, you cannot really validate everything end to end until you let people to use your prototype. And only then you can actually see if people are using it or not. And this is the most, let's say, frustrating and magical thing, to be honest. To mitigate risk, obviously create a fiction, to try to create as much of a fictional prototype as possible. So it can be not production ready. It can be done using any kind of tooling that is available nowadays, like Figma or whatever, where you can create a clickable prototype that is actually almost code-free, and you can let people interact with it and get some early feedback. there is quite a lot of information on how to do prototype with less resource investment as possible. Obviously, prototypes can have different levels of fidelity, and depending on your users, depending on the problem you're solving, and depending on your solution hypothesis, you want to test prototypes in different levels of fidelity. If you're trying to test something that is more of a technical nature, if you're, for instance, solving a solution for software engineers or for any more technical type of work, you want to create a much more refined prototype, because you cannot really test it if you are not able to process some kind of data or send data packages back and forth and so on. But if it's this solution is more of a user-facing component, has more user-facing components, and it's all about the user experience, then you can do it with a lesser degree of fidelity, and you can do it by using some kind of no-code prototyping solution. In some books that you might have read or not, there are examples where people used like a block of wood and just some drawn button on it to test early, I think it was a personal digital assistant prototype, just to see how it would work. You can conduct focus groups, consumer surveys, or any other ways to gather user feedback. User interviews, definitely the one. And obviously at this stage, you will need to be leveraging everything you can possibly to do this. So your friends, your connections, your network, whatever is possible, because at early stage of the startup, you need to be hustling all the time. So probably do not think of those focus groups and consumer surveys as in a very robust and scientific way, but more of a way to gather as much validation as possible through the means that are available to you. And as I said, focus on user experience and functional capabilities experienced by the users. Even if for technical solution, you still want to focus on, let's say if it's an engineering solution, you still want to be focusing on experience that is experienced by engineers themselves. So understanding if the problem that they have experienced with the solution that you have provided, or prototype you have provided, that this problem is being solved. And then product launch. So assuming that you received the valuable feedback from your prototype testing and had confidence that your MVP will work, it's time to build the actual product. So MVP is obviously not the final product, it's just a step in the right direction. And once you have the product, you want to obviously do a pre-release access to a small number of qualified users. And the same as it was prototype, you want to instrument and provide channels for qualitative feedback. Essentially, think of it that at every stage of this product market fit process, you want to gather as much validation data as possible, so you do not over-invest at the next stage. So in rethinking it is essentially, it's a funnel where you gather more and more feedback and you validate more and more assumptions or hypotheses at every stage of the funnel, even when you have validated the MVP and when you validated your prototype. Even before, once you build the final solution, you still want to get as much feedback as possible to understand that what you have built is actually the things that people actually need and really want, and we'll talk about if they want to pay for it. Also, keep iterating all the time. The scientific method does not apply only at the stage of pre-prototyping. It also applies later on, and this applies also once you have certain first traction. And pretty much scientific method is what's being used in product development all across its life cycles, even during feature development, product market fit expansion, and growth. And yeah, after you do the first launch or first release, after you ship your MVP or your initial product, you need to do post-launch analysis. You need to understand what's working, what's not, what features we should add or lose, as was discussed before. And this is where your first roadmap comes into place, because this is where you're trying to need to understand, okay, what are the next steps? What are the features we're building next? And obviously, I'm not covering the roadmap part during this lecture, but if somebody interested, we can discuss it afterwards. You also want to revise your hypothesis if some things that after conducting the research, some things had changed. So you need to always go back to your initial documents and revise them and see if the things that you initially assumed are still hold true. And obviously, it's quite possible that in order to achieve higher level of product market fit, you will need to pivot. So you need to change one or more of your major hypotheses, everything from your initial market attractiveness, your persona, your one of your needs that you have identified, to your solution and so on. So pivot means that you are changing anything within the product market fit pyramid. Significantly changing means that you are pivoting your company. So if you achieved all of that, you achieved what is called product market fit. But that's only achieving the product market fit. Apart from this, there is another part that is quite important and a lot of people forget, which is go-to-market strategy or market traction, and we'll be covering it in a second part of the lecture. I took 15 minutes more than intended, so I think I will go through the questions, or maybe, okay. Okay, so the first, Agna is asking, can I share the link where good quantitative data can be found? Maybe you can remind me post this lecture, and I will provide you with some things that is possible. Obviously, some market research papers cost quite a lot, but there are ways how to get certain market data without spending a huge amount of money on those expensive market research. To be honest, I have spent during my life probably hundreds of thousands on market research, and I would say about 50% of it is decent, and really good is about 10%. The rest is quite trash. So the freely available information on things like Statista and so on sometimes actually is good enough to validate some market size potential. If you need a more in-depth information, it's trickier, but usually it's much easier to conduct your own research. Another really valuable source of information that I personally use much more often is publicly traded company data. For instance, I'm helping one company on researching financial, how to put it, the landscape of financial product aggregation, things like banking loans, insurance, different types of travel insurance, and so on and so on. And there are companies in UK and US like Money Supermarket or like, and I forget another, that have quarterly, one of this quarterly, one is yearly financial statements, where because they need to share this data with shareholders, so you can find a lot of market information, or you can extrapolate a lot of market information from the data they share with their shareholders. And for me, it is one of the more valuable, actually, because this is definitely true. You can see also how the company performs. They also even sometimes share their strategies and so on and so on. So if you want to enter some market that some bigger company is already operating on, I would suggest looking at the public information of public markets.
But I will also remind you, Daniel, to list a couple of links or books or anything you find valuable on this topic, and I will share with the rest of the participants after the lecture, so no worries on that. Yeah.
So how do you calculate? So Arseny is asking, how do you calculate the market size? This is tricky. Generally, the market sizes, there are two ways how to do it. How generally the market size is calculated. One way is total market spend yearly, and then another one is market capitalization. If there are no publicly traded or no big company in the market, then capitalization is can be tricky. So then you need to be looking for total market spend, unless this market is super niche. So there are ways to do it. So you can either start with the umbrella market and say that, well, we are operating in this umbrella market. For instance, let's take for instance, digital displays, right? So the total size of digital displays, let's say it's about 100 billion, which is a total market cap. But then you need to understand that's all digital displays, but you need to, for instance, narrow it down for, I don't know, displays used in laptops only. So you need to start looking, okay, what is the displays being produced for B2B market and what is B2C? So that's kind of already partial is down. And then you need to look how many, what's the total market for consumer devices, display produced for consumer devices. And even if you cannot narrow it down for, let's say, laptops, you can still estimate quite well what is the size of the market for consumer displays. And then what you can do is try to extrapolate it, merging with some other data. Let's say, what is the total number of devices being produced, let's say, mobile devices versus laptop, and then merge this data and try to extrapolate what the approximate market size would be. In initial rounds, raising rounds, especially if you're in a very niche market, nobody will expect you to have a really precise data about your market size. Some overall ballpark is good enough. Once you get to Series A, then you will have the money to buy expensive research, and you will need to estimate the market size more precisely, because that's what those VC funds will be asking, and they will be double checking against their data as well. How do you estimate demand for unrealized need, i.e. product that brings new behavior for customer? Totally unclear how new things will be adopted. That's true. That's why it's so hard. And if you read through early stages of Airbnb or Uber, one's like the best example of unrealized company that solved unrealized needs. It wasn't that easy, and they had to iterate through quite a few solutions and also so quite a few personas. So it's not easy, and it's where you need to iterate a lot, but and also you need to iterate with a business model as well, which we'll cover in the second part. But essentially it's the same way validation as with any other need. So if you've built some kind of solution and you show it to, let's say, 10 friends of yours or 10 potential customers, and they, at least on the prototype, say that they need it, and once you build it and you price it correctly, which again we'll be covering in the next part, that's just the traction you will get. You still need to go through this whole funnel and need to be iterating through the whole funnel and getting it to the final prototype. You cannot really get the validation from the market, like the final validation from the market, unless you go through the whole product market fit pyramid. So the next question is, a lot of people don't know what they need. Good salesperson. Okay, so what they need. A good salesperson can sell anything to them. From other side, too much information around us. Let people, I don't need. Yes, so this is the last part about, this is not a question, this is a statement that good product without good promotion could stay on the ground. Again, this is what we will be covering in the second part of the lecture. And you will have the final part of your series of lectures about growth. So how, what are the tactics to achieve, to can get your product off the ground and start scaling it? Because I completely agree, it's having the good product, but also having a great having a great distribution. If you can nail both the good product and the great distribution, then you have a you have a successful business. Okay, an example of a product went from one idea to another during validation phase. For example, company started out with product X, which turned into product Y after several iterations. I will not go too far. I can mention Printify, for instance. So we started with a product that was essentially as an aggregator. We still wanted to build a solution that would integrate print providers on one side and people who want to sell branded merchandise on the other side. But initially, we were not disclosing who our print providers are. And actually, we were pretending to be a print provider or manufacturer for more common use ourselves. This worked. We did get some traction. We get some early revenue, but that revenue didn't really left the ground because there were a lot of problems with that. We couldn't solve all the problems with the solution that we worked. So after a year of let's say struggles, we entered 500 Startups, which is one of the accelerator programs in San Francisco. And then there are a couple of mentors suggested us to, instead of trying to do the aggregation model, try to do a marketplace model where the supply side is transparent, as in we disclose who are the suppliers are. And for us, it was really scary because we thought like, well, the users then will go directly to the suppliers, why they would need us. But it actually was a really great decision. We tested it initially in a, let's say, in a closed beta and then exposing it to everybody. And this is actually one of the reasons why we grew so fast, essentially over 100 times in 3 years, because we transitioned from one business model to another. Well, it's actually not only the business model, the pricing has changed, a lot of things have changed, but this was one of the iteration, and there was some iteration in between trying to solve the same problem. I'm just not going to go through all of them. Okay, so scientific method applied for testing. Depending on where you apply scientific method, either in earlier stages or later stages. In early stages, for instance, one of the company that I'm working right now, we are working without disclosing too much in providing financial capabilities for different e-commerce companies. And I was working pretty much through all of the same steps that I mentioned. I have a lot of documentation. And while doing my research, while talking to the bigger e-commerce companies in Europe, like Amazon and Farfetch and Zalando, I kind of was pitching them. We would offer you this capability to offer financial services to your merchants. Would that be interesting? During that, I found out they already kind of offer it, but they offer it through third parties, but they're not happy with those third parties because those third parties have outdated software. The integration was bad. So we iterated, and we, instead of offering the same service, which would be like a third-party service, we thought what we would offer some kind of more of white label solution where it would be branded by you, and we would offer you all the capabilities to do that, which is actually an iteration on it. I'm obviously being a bit too cryptic, but generally that's how it worked. And we iterated the solution, and now we are getting a much better validation that this is actually something those companies need. And this is where we changed from one idea to another, although we always knew that it is going to be some kind of financial solution for e-commerce companies. About value and service convenience, what to say to investor, how even to react if your direct competition, which is one, says that they do pre-order, but they do not deliver. I think I need a bit more context on this one. Maybe Agne, if you can just unmute yourself and comment, because I don't really understand the question. Or we can skip it till the end, and then I can answer it later. Okay, and so then Christoph says, what is your thought process on killing this feature, the features? What are the quantitative measures you follow before removing the feature? So it's a very complex process, to be honest. Without going into too much detail, if you have already launched product and this product is fully functional and you have some users within it, and you can analyze their behavior, the approaches will be completely different from when you are just launching the product. I would say that initially in the first year, you probably shouldn't be really worried about killing the features, because I don't think that the main reason why you kill features later on is that they do not add to the to overall bundle of value that you want to provide. And why you want to kill them is because you want to free up the real estate that is always very valuable in your product. So it means that these features take certain real estate within the product, which potentially can be used for something else. And also this feature is not reached its adoption. So for any feature, you essentially want to measure things like adoption, retention, and satisfaction. And if it didn't reach those target adoption, retention, and satisfaction metrics, it takes up real estate, and it also, any feature takes some kind of support from your engineering, and then you calculate how much support it will take, let's say per year, per quarter, whatever, versus freeing it and building essentially an opportunity cost that can be replaced with any other feature, then you would potentially kill it. The problem is, well, not the problem, the thing is that at early stage, your product probably has too much real estate, and even if this feature does not reach some kind of target adoption, retention, and satisfaction metric, it's still worth keeping it until you achieve the problem, or you reach the problem that I described earlier, which is when it's becoming too much of a burden. There are obviously some other reasons, but that's not really part of the conversation for achieving product market fit. Should we take, I know we are a bit late on time, can we grab 5 minutes, 3 to 5 minutes break, and then let's say reconvene in 1925? Does that sounds good?
Yeah, let's do that. I'll pause the recording for now, but the link is going to remain open. Okay. So
1925 then.
5 minutes, yes.
Yep. Cool. All right, so we covered the first part. We covered the first part, which is achieving the product market fit. But then there is another part, which is as important to get traction, is go-to-market strategy. And I think the main reason why I really wanted to cover two parts today instead of just the product market fit is that I see more often than I would like to when I'm consulting some startup is that they achieve the product market fit, they have a first launch, and then they enter what's called product death cycle. Essentially, they launch, they get some traction, and then this traction starts diminishing. They think, oh shit, we need to launch some more feature to get even more traction. And then they launch the feature, they have some uptick, and then it's again goes down. Then they launch one and one more, then it down. And essentially means that it's kind of this death cycle where they're launching more features, they're throwing more money at the problem, but nothing happens. And in a lot of cases, why this is happening is because to build a $100 million company, or well, $1 billion company actually as well, achieving only product market fit is unfortunately not enough. Apart from that, you also need to achieve two more things. And one more thing is your model fit, so market model fit. And in that case, what we mean by model is your monetization model. How do you monetize your product, and how this model fits the market you're trying to capture? On top of that, you also need to achieve what is called product channel fit and model channel fit, because as was mentioned in some of the suggestions prior, is that only having a great product that solves a certain need and addresses a problem in a certain market is not enough. You also need to have certain level of distribution. And then to do that, you need to have channels that work for that distribution. So essentially, this is answering two questions. How do you monetize and how do you distribute? But distribute, I mean, essentially, it's marketing, sales, or whatever else. Essentially, how do you get your product in the hands of the customers? And first, we'll start with monetization. So monetization also has a lot of different frameworks. I personally use the one that I'm going to be sharing with you today, which is akin to the product market fit pyramid, but is a bit more simplified. The first one, you need to understand what the problems that we solve. That's always start with a problem. Then who we are solving the problems here. In this case, the who is not as important as the problem, but that's a different framework. That's why. And the last one is how do we solve the problem? So what is the solution that we're providing? It's very akin to the same product market pyramid, but it's a simplified version of it. So what it means is that you have a business hypothesis on how your use case overlies with your monetization model. And in use case is a problem we're solving and who we're solving for. And then monetization case, and before we go into the monetization model, so the use case usually consists, again, the problem, the persona, the why. So why users choose our product to solve the problem. So what are the competitive advantages we outlined before. And the last one is frequency, which we didn't discuss previously in depth, but I think it's important to understand it here. The frequency of the problem is a very important topic. It's also used, it's also called natural problem frequency, because if the problem occurs only once a year, or the problem occurs, let's say, once a week or once even a day, the way you monetize your solution will look completely different from one to another. So that's one thing that you definitely need to keep in mind. And so this monetization model is essentially your monetization strategy that you choose to tie into the use case. And monetization model usually has 4 parts to it. So the first one is how do your price scales. Why it is important is it is maybe not as important for B2C users, but it is super important for your B2B users. So if your product is B2B, listen carefully. So your price needs to be tied into certain metric, a certain property that scales as usage of the product scales. So one way how to do it is to use a feature differentiated strategy where prices scale as users add more features or use more features. That's a very good example for those who used Figma. If you want to use more features, like I think there is an advanced designer or some UI component library integration. I haven't used it for about 4 or 5 months personally, so I don't remember, but I do remember that they have certain plans differ depending on what features you are using. As I said, Pro and Org plans are feature differentiated. Also, the same thing goes for LinkedIn. If you ever tried LinkedIn Pro or LinkedIn Recruit or LinkedIn Sales, all of them have different features on how you can discover profiles, how you can interact with them, how many messages you can send or at all. So recruiter plan, sales plan, and just premium premium plan, they have different features, so they differentiate on a feature basis. Another one, a usage value metric. So your price scales as users use the product more. So those who don't know, Segment is essentially kind of customer data platform / ETL platform to allow to collect data from multiple sources and pass it to a lot of sources. So you can collect it from like Facebook, your email marketing platform, from your backend, and so on, and send it to multiple other platforms like your maybe a sales CRM or your online collection and so on, they have hundreds of integrations. So you if you build some advanced products, you don't need to worry about integrating with all the products. So that's what segment value proposition is. When the price scales, so you pay more the more monthly tracked users you have on their platform. So I mean, if you start out and you start with, let's say, I don't know, let's say 500 users, or let's say 10 even users on your product, as you scale into hundreds or thousands of users, your price will go up because they charge you based on how many monthly active tracked users you have. Same for Slack. I think it's a more familiar product. They charge you based on the number of Slack users are using Slack. So if your organization grows, your pricing per user, your total price goes up, although in most cases, your price per user goes down. So the total price goes up, the price per user usually goes down with the scale. And then there is outcome-based pricing, where your pricing scales with a function of the outcome. So for instance, user testing, which is user experience, user research company where you can find leads or potential customers for your product, and conduct interviews and test some prototypes, which is for those who actually haven't done this. This is a small suggestion. So user testing allows you to recruit users which fit certain criteria. They may be B2B users, they may be B2C users, they may have certain backgrounds. They have a huge database of users that can be recruited and interviewed. And you can test, you can conduct different scenarios to test the product, you can do whatever, but essentially they charge you per lead and per interview conducted. So it's an outcome-based metric. The same goes for Eventbrite. Eventbrite is quite similar. Well, for those who don't know, it's similar to what's the name of Latvia? Biļešu service, I think. So it's similar to that, but a bit more functionality. It's a much larger organization and much more advanced. And now they also allow for online selling tickets for online events and so on and so on. So they charge you for, well, essentially per ticket sale. So it's again an outcome. So once we understand how price scales, you need to understand what features or attributes the customer get from each use case. So what are you actually charging for? I don't have a lot of slides here because I understood I needed to move fast. But essentially, let's say take the same Sigma. You can see that the scale is per editor. But what is they allow you 3 projects in 30 days. They allow you unlimited project. They allow you for organization design system and so on. So they have a feature differentiated product. They scale per editor, but what being charged for is different in each plan. And if you look at other subscription product or even a transactional product, the what is different. In transactional product, the what is obviously it's the transaction itself. It's either a ticket purchase or a ride purchased in Bolt, or the food purchased in Bolt, and whatever it might be, plus the service delivery fee. So then the amount, how much do we charge? So this one is a tricky one, and it's a lot depends on, well, we need to talk about the one thing that kind of coined the name here is average annual revenue per customer per use case. So how do you define, so the way how what you charge for, how much you charge for is usually defined through the metric called average annual revenue per customer. Sometimes it's called just average revenue per customer, or ARPU. This is RPC. That doesn't matter which one you use, but essentially it's kind of standardize the way you charge across multiple domains and multiple monetization methods, both subscription and transactional. And what it looks like is how much per customer, not per user, which is important, you get per year based on your monetization model. Why it's not per user but per customer, especially if you're in B2B. In B2B, sometimes your customers are not your users, as in Slack. Your customer usually is a company and your users are individual users of Slack. Or in cases of marketplaces or platforms, like for instance, Facebook essentially is free. So its users are not paying anything, but they also have customers who are advertisers who are paying on transactional basis, but they also have those customers as actually users who are usually the advertiser or Facebook advertising managers who are also not customers who are actually paying. So it's a bit more complex. So it's better to look per customer. And well, Facebook here is on 0 because it's looked here as a user, but in either case, depending on the company, depending on what the problem you're facing, and depending on the frequency of the problem, and we want to charge different amounts of money. And there's also, I will show the flow chart afterwards, understanding how much you need to be charging depending on your product. But essentially, if your good rule of thumb, if your problem natural occurrence frequency is high, you want to make this product almost free or close to free. If the problem occurrence is less frequent, then you want to do a large upfront contract. And what I mean by problem occurrence, in some cases, especially if you go to enterprise sales, the problem occurrence might be high within the company, but the decision when we want to address this problem can maybe made only once a year or twice a year. As in once, for instance, in case with Palantir, which is kind of an advanced data science platform that allows processing large data sets. Companies probably do not make decision to migrate from one solution to another every week. They probably make such a decision once a year, or maybe some case couple times in a decade. Same thing with Workday. You probably do not migrate from one HR solution to another every day. You do it much less frequencies. That's why they want to have a larger upfront contract. So Netflix and Dropbox, you can do it, migrate like pretty much every month. ClassPass and MailChimp, not as easy, but still you can do cycles through multiple email solutions multiple times a year. So depending on that, you want to charge different prices. But this is something we'll also discuss a bit later. And then the last one is when do we charge for what? And this is where it's also depends a lot on your frequency, because some products that you use quite often, and sometimes you don't want to charge ever. And again, then for more enterprise software solution, you want to charge every few years or at least yearly, and sometimes even sign multiple year contracts. So you lock in the customer and you understand that the onboarding time will take, I don't know, let's say a couple of months, and they will only get to the actual value, let's say in 3 to 4 months after they onboard with the product. So here is a chart for, I'm not going to go through all of it, but essentially how it works. There are multiple ifs. How you decide when to charge and how to charge. So the first thing is obviously a customer willing to pay to solving this problem, and sometimes customers like the solution, they like using it, but whenever you decide to charge them, say, well, F it, I don't need it. I'm fine with it, and in most cases it's where it's not a problem. It's a problem more akin to vitamin, and it's not a pain. So the solution is more akin to the vitamin and not a painkiller, as in it solves a problem, but it's not really solves a really painful need. In that case, especially it relates mostly to entertainment product where people can live without a certain level of escapism. So that's where people are hesitant to pay. If the customers are willing to pay, then you need to look at their natural usage frequency. So it's either low or high. If the natural usage frequency is low, you probably want to get back to transaction. And also you need to look not only natural usage frequency, but also variance in natural usage frequency, because sometimes in certain product, you can see that they would be using them on a very consistent, let's say, weekly or daily or monthly basis. For instance, things like, let's say Shopify, which allows you to run your e-commerce store. The recurrency is high because you cannot really run your store without it, and you pretty much if you're running your business on it, you're probably using it almost on daily basis, maybe excluding weekends. So that's where you have recurring payments. But then if you have something more akin to Uber or Bolt rides, where sometimes you take it very often, sometimes you're not taking it at all for weeks on end, then you want to stick to the transaction. And then the same goes for adoption. So what is the natural frequency of adoption? And that means how much time it takes the user to adopt the product. And my bad. So, how long does it take to form a habit means how long for user it takes to establish a habit around using the product. In some cases, you can establish a habit within a couple of users. So, for instance, for Bolt, they consider that after the second ride, and if the both rides were 5 stars, it considers that people establish the habit. So it's actually much more short term of recurrence. And then if it's a much longer product to establish a habit, especially it happens in things like let's say analytics software, enterprise analytics software, something akin to Amplitude or any kind of really heavy analytics software, and it takes a long time to establish the habit. And also the natural frequency of adoption means that how many times they're going to be using the product while they're adopting it. If it's a very frequent usage during the adoption, then you also want to have a short-term contract, and if it's a low, then it's a long-term contract. We can also discuss it a bit later. And then this is how it looks like. So you have your use cases and you have your monetization model that takes into account how the price scales for what you're charging, what the amount you're charging for, and also when you're charging. So this is where taking all of this into account, you can establish a model that fits your market, and it also fits your product very well. One couple of things to remember here is that price does not equal value. So it means that sometimes you can charge more for less value, and now sometimes you can deliver more value for less price. So those things are not equal. So it sometimes means that you need to keep your price lower and deliver more and more value. So do not essentially equate those. Same thing as more features does not equal value. Sometimes you need to kill features, sometimes you need to add more features, and sometimes you add features and you do not value. So that's also one thing to remember. Generally, what you want to have is price to be lower than willingness to pay. So it means that if your price is higher than willingness to pay, customers will not transact with us or with you. It means that you need to understand for what you are charging, what value you're delivering, and does your price scale well into the larger, more value delivered. And one more thing is to remember is monthly recurring and per transaction. It's also not equal in the sense that if you add a lot of friction, if you're charging customer on preferred schedule, they will not transact with you. So what I mean by that is that for products that may have a quite high frequency, but a very unpredictable frequency, people still will prefer to pay a transactional fee, as in pay on transaction basis, despite having a quite frequent occurrence. As opposite, sometimes when the solution is more of an e-commerce platform, but customers use it on a daily basis to, let's say, discover things, despite it, the value you're delivering is a transactional value, people would still prefer to have a recurring fee. So one example is this: there is a Lithuanian company that was acquired by Shopify that were offering Oberlo, for those who might know them. They essentially offer a platform for Amazon, sorry, not Amazon, but Alibaba's discovery of the product for dropshipping purposes. So essentially, it is allowing to a transactional functionality where they can dropship the product to mostly people in US, but also in Europe, and integrate with Alibaba to kind of automatically ship them. But they still charge a monthly recurring fee, and I think there is almost no, maybe some small payment fee per transaction, or it's close to zero. Yeah, so this is kind of just a summary of all told. So you have understanding the user view. So you have your business hypothesis and you have your user hypothesis. So from user perspective, from business perspective, you need to ask your question is how does a price scale? From user perspective is they want to know how does value of the product scale for me. Same, I'm not going to read through all of this. You can hopefully you can read yourself. But essentially, this is the questions you need to be asking yourself when you're designing a price or designing a monetization strategy. And unless you can nail all of them, there will not be a market model fit, and there will not be a channel model fit, which we'll jump into next. So if you establish the market model fit, and next is the final part of the equation is a product channel fit and model channel fit. I'm not going to go honestly in too much detail about this because I think most of it is, well, majority of it will be covered during the growth session, but I'll just put some fundamentals in place so that you understand how this fits into the larger pictures. So if we're talking about distribution channels, there are a lot of ways how you can drive acquisition. The growth overall is just a humongous topic to learn about. And I've been in the space for more than now almost 15 years soon, and still learning new stuff all the time. But the good place where to start, I would suggest to read the book Traction. In Traction, it's a startup guide to getting customers, essentially. But in Traction, they have a concept called 19 channels to get traction. And again, I'm not going to go through all of them. You can read the book, you can see the channels. What I want to talk about is that not all channels are equal, and some channels are much more suited for different products and different markets than the others, and different models as well. So one thing I kind of would like to note here is that products are built to fit channels, not the other way around. And what it means is that it's really hard to try to kind of this old saying goes, build it and they will come, or build it and then marketing people will figure out which channels to use to attract customer. Unfortunately, that's not really true. And everybody who tells you otherwise just doesn't know their shit. The thing is that channels can make or break your company, and there are a lot of examples in the world like that. So why it is important? There is a concept of power law of distribution, and what it means that a lot of companies find one channel that works very well for them, and for a while, almost 70 or even more % of their acquisition comes from this channel, especially in early life. And this is true for pretty much every company I have worked and I have consulted. They usually in early phases, up until I would say year 3, 4, 5, they rely on one channel that they have figured out and it really worked for them. And that's why understanding how to make certain channels work is very important. Obviously, in the long run, you don't want to be relying on one channel. You want to diversify, but knowing how much effort it takes to make the one channel work and how much experimentation you need to go through to make this one channel work, it's just a matter of capabilities, a matter of resources that you have available at your disposal. So what I mean by that is that product channel fit is your blessing and your demise at the same time. There are a lot of companies that essentially were created based on new channels that appear. So for instance, if you look at the dating companies, so the Match.com was pretty much built on top of banner ads. Then when search appeared, Plenty of Fish as a company kind of skyrocketed. Then social appeared and Zoosk kind of gained a lot of traction. And then now that the mobile channel is the most popular one, Tinder is one of the leading, although everything is owned pretty much by one company here, but what we can see is that new channels create new companies, and it's important to understand that because each of those companies, both the monetization, the product design, the interaction between customers and monetization models, they are designed in a way to accommodate the channel through which they acquire most of the users, or how they get the product in the hands of the users, so to speak. And then the other thing is here that all channels are also sometimes killed off. And I don't mean that channels completely get killed off. It means that they lose their efficiency, or for some reason, they do not work as intended previously. There are a lot of examples like that. So for instance, Zynga, which is like gaming development for social media, it was gained a lot of traction in the Facebook early days. Produced a lot of famous games like Farmville for Facebook, and mostly how they got it is through Facebook Graph API and back then super cheap ads. But then Graph API got killed off. Some of the app stores on the Facebook got killed off, and they lost a lot of those channels, and they still exist, and they kind of revamped their strategies. They adapted more to the mobile, but for a while they were struggling a lot, although they were at one point one of the highest valued company in the world, definitely in the gaming space, and that can be painful. The same thing goes for instance, for Pinterest, who grew also on Facebook Graph API and gained a lot of users using Facebook Graph API. And when Graph API was killed by Facebook, they struggled a lot. They revamped the growth model and then kind of recovered. But there are also stories that didn't end up with kind of recuperating, and the companies just died off. And one more thing is, it's called not ARPU, but RPC, but is understanding model channel fit, not only product channel fit, but also model channel fit. And here it's very important to understand two things: how the average annual revenue per customer correlates to your cost to acquire a customer. So your SAT to ARPU or RPC. So essentially, there is a spectrum of RPC to SATs, and there is kind of companies and channels on both sides of the spectrum. So on the low side of the spectrum, where your annual revenue per customer is low, you cannot afford to pay a lot of money to acquire the customer. So it means that you have to rely on channels that are generally cheap or much more scalable. So everything that is SEO, search engine optimization in B2C space, or any kind of virality that is super cost efficient to produce at mass scale and scales very well. That's something that you want to consider if your revenue per customer is very low. If your revenue per customer goes up, then you can start thinking of channels like search engine marketing and display, which is paid essentially marketing. Think of Facebook ads, Google ads, and so on, and some other network ads. So once your let's say revenue per customer goes into hundreds per year, well, above 100, let's say, then you can start thinking about paid ads. On the other end of the spectrum, you have more of a B2B channels. So in companies that are not enterprise, you can do B2B content generation, you can do inbound sales, because first of all, the number of customers is quite high. The number of potential customers for HubSpot is probably in in the hundreds of thousands, because everybody needs some kind of CRM and marketing CRM if they're doing any kind of online marketing in B2B. On the other hand, number of companies that need as a heavy lifter in terms of data scientist Palantir or something akin to Workday, which is a very enterprise heavy solution for quite big customers that do a lot of hiring and a lot of have a lot of employees working for them. You probably doing some kind of B2B content might work at certain execution, but what you want to probably focus on is some kind of enterprise sales. But in the middle there is what is called danger zone, and it is because if you fall into one side of the spectrum, you're in a place where you can struggle with your company. And the main reason is that if you fall into this danger zone and you try to use, let's say, viral B2C and SEM, you have too much friction via monetization. So it means that your pricing is quite high, and people who landed on your product via cheap channels, they do not feel that the price you're asking is validated, or they don't understand the value from the get-go that you're asking to the value they provide from the get-go to justify the price. Okay, so that's the explanation. And then on the other hand, you have, if you fall here, but your price of the product is not high enough, you can just not justify, you not support a higher SaaS channels, because there is a rule of thumb that I don't remember who told me, but that if you want to do sales, enterprise sales in US, you need to be aiming for at least $100,000 per year per contract. Otherwise, it just does not justify hiring a sales team, because sales reps in US are very expensive, and you cannot just afford them. So you might want to and if you're falling like below in the B2B content or inbound sales, then you probably cannot even justify paying SaaS for that. So that's something they need to be looking out for. Again, I'm not covering channels in a too much depth, because I hope it will be covered in the last section. But that's essentially something that you need to be thinking when you're designing both your product market fit, but also thinking about how you want to monetize your product and how you want to distribute, because all of those things are moving in conjunction, and depending on how you design all of it can influence all other parts of your equation, and vice versa. So that's it for today. Now I'm ready for some questions, and we ended on time. Okay, are there questions in chat? No, no new questions in chat. So maybe somebody wants to just ask them.
Again, I can remind you that there's an opportunity to apply for the one-on-one session with Daniel in case you have a bit more sensitive question, perhaps, or maybe it takes a bit of explaining to get into your specific business case to get to that question. So no worries if you're done for the day. I think the amount of information was also quite extensive, especially knowing that this is the first session. So what about, in case you don't have any more questions for today, I will share this recording with you so you can go through the slides and information once again and see how that applies to your specific business case. And in case you have a question to Daniel to discuss in this one-on-one meeting, just write to me specifically, or there's also a questionnaire in the form that I sent you a couple of days ago where you can apply for this session with Daniel. But otherwise, I think this was super valuable. I wrote down so many things, even though I'm just managing this program and I don't have a specific business case to apply this to, but definitely some things to keep in mind, and also a great way to kickstart this whole program. I think I speak on behalf of all of us. So thank you so much, Daniel.
Cool.
So yes, I will send everyone more information on the one-on-one session. So no worries on that. I think it's going to be clear in Slack via messages. If there's any other comments or any other last questions, we can still get to that in time. But otherwise, thank you so much. A lot of great feedback already rolling into the comment section. And again, I will get a list of books or links or anything Daniel finds insightful for this specific topic and share with you afterwards. So this is not the last time we hear of Daniel, for sure. But thank you so much, Daniel, really.
Thanks. Have a nice evening, everyone. Bye.
Yes, bye.
Bye.
See you in a week.
Thank you.